Welcome to Food Friends, a podcast inspiring home cooks to try new dishes in the kitchen by sharing trusted recipes, tips, and friendship. Hi, I'm Sonia.
And I'm Carrie. We met in Los Angeles over 15 years ago as personal chefs and haven't stopped talking about food since. We're so glad you're here. Hi, Sonia.
Hi, Carrie.
Sonia, I'm excited to see you today.
Well, it is a tough day. We were planning to record something very different. And, we usually record a week or two ahead of when we release. And right now, the LA fires have been burning this week. And you are there in
Yes.
LA on the ground and have so many people in your life affected. Although, for all our listeners, Carrie's safe. Obviously,
Yes.
she has power, her home is safe. And, on our end, LA was my home for 13 years. We have family there. We have so many loved ones like you. It's been a tough week.
Yeah, and I think for me, being on the ground, one of the decisions that certainly made with myself, and then also with you, is like I want to keep a sense of as much normalcy in my life as I can, and connecting with you up in our business and talking about food is important, and that's also something that's feeding me and helping me feed the other people in my life. And so us deciding to record today was like giving me some structure, and we came to this with a different conversation that we were going to have. And then we decided to talk about this because, it's very present for me and you right now. But this is always going on in the world. People need to be fed. And whether it's in a crisis like the one that we're experiencing, or in joy when someone has a baby, or when someone has had a surgery and just needs to, there's always need for cooking for people. And so we've decided to talk about what are some of the things that we do and make, and how do we show up for people when they need it.
Yeah, and if cooking is your thing, I think that's what you seek to help with. I think it's really important when it's so overwhelming like this. It's like, what is the thing I can do? I've heard people talk about it's like treat just one person the way you would want to be treated instead of trying to cover everyone, because that's not possible for most of us, And so I think you and I both know that the way we can serve and help is with food in some capacity. It's our go-to. So I really want to hear about what you're cooking for people, because I just knew right when this started, I was like, okay, Carrie's in the kitchen. She is she's on delivery duty. Those mason jars are she's whipping them out. She's filling them up. I mean, I know who you are. And I know that in a time of crisis, you're not even thinking. You're like, I'm getting to the kitchen. What do I have in my pantry? What can I make right now? So part of the inspiration for this conversation is really, I want to know. I mean, I want us to talk about it, and I want us to be able to share, because hearing what you make for your community and your loved ones always inspires me when I am needing to cook for someone in my community.
Same. And, and I think about how this podcast has really, and of course our friendship, this longtime friendship that we have, but how having these conversations with you always gives me more ideas for, spaces like this. And, I will just share, like, before all of these fires happened, we had a friend whose house burned down right after Christmas. And so I had already gone into this mode of like, making soups. Yes, that's always an easy thing for me to make. I'm great at making soup. I definitely have a storage of mason jars that are ready to deploy at any moment. But I had also started baking the bread that we talked about on our podcast. I started making Adrian Hale's bread recipe, and I think it's a little bit of a rhythm in the kitchen. And so I had started doing it, and then there's this need that's happening. And so now I sort of have like I have this bread baking operation going on in my kitchen where I have like a storage of bread flour now, and I've got my whole wheat flour, and I've got my starter, and I'm feeding it. And so I had already had some of that in mind, and had given a couple of deliveries to our friends to share with their family who had lost their home. And so when all of this started to happen, what I am experiencing a lot in my life is that my friends are in hotels. And delivering soup to hotels is not going to work in this moment. They can't eat them, they can't reheat them. And so, one of our recent guests was Zoe Francois. And, I have her book, and we talked about these morning cookies that she makes. And I just thought, okay, I can make morning cookies and I can take those to people who, it's like a good snack for them. It's got a decent dose of nutrition. Um, it's got like some energy that will sustain someone. And so I've been baking her morning cookies, which I think is honestly like a perfect recipe.
I wanna hear more about the recipe because when she was on our show, she shared how she makes these cookies and
Yeah.
she eats them before she goes to the gym and her
After,
tr
after
oh,
her
after,
workout. Yes,
after, and
after her workout.
her trainer approves the snack because it has all the things that the trainer wanted her to be eating. So can you remind me of, like, what goes into these cookies?
Yeah, so it's whole grain oats, it's, nuts, toasted nuts. There are pepitas, which is a toasted pumpkin seed, which are very crunchy, and I will say, as someone who's made several, I've made several batches of them now, just a very cute reminder about a pepita is when you toast it, as it's cooling, it, like, makes this snap, crackle, pop sound. It's like they sort of talk to you, and so I've been toasting sheets of pepitas, and when I pull them out of my oven, they're just sort of crackling along on my stove. And so I've toasted those. I've toasted pecans. I've toasted your hazelnuts from Oregon. I toasted a whole pan of cashews yesterday. So there's nuts, there's oats, there's a good amount of coconut oil, which makes them really rich. There's tiny chocolate chips. There's a mashed banana. And, it really takes about, once you've got all of your ingredients kind of prepped, your nuts are toasted and chopped. You assemble everything into a big bowl, and then the smart idea that she offers is you let it sit for about 15 minutes. And I think that helps the oats like soak up some of that oil and get that all those flavors sort of mixed together. And then you scoop them out onto a baking sheet, and they do look like a cookie. They're full of so many great ingredients. And you can hand those to someone, or you can put them in a baggie and drop them off at someone's house or their hotel.
So they're totally gluten-free because the oats are gluten-free, and there's no egg, and there's no butter. It's just the coconut oil and the mashed banana holding it and binding it together. Is that right?
So there is a little she calls for whole grain flour, which you could definitely sub with a
Oh,
gluten-free flour. So I actually have a lot of einkorn flour that I've been using for my bread baking. And so I've been putting a scoop of that into that helps bind it a little bit. And then there's also honey, which a lot of vegans don't
yeah.
believe, don't count as vegan. So you could also sub in maple syrup, which I did on one of my batches. I had run out of honey, so I used the maple syrup, and that was delicious as well. So
Oh, but that's good to
it's
know.
it's a beautiful recipe, and I've been making it as is. I've also been like, whatever I kind of have in my pantry in the moment, that's what I've been baking with. And I find that, like, also as a parent who's cooked for other parents that have had children, or when people cooked for me when I had Mac, that's a great it's a great kind of like quick meal, like a granola bar that to give someone that's homemade, that has a lot of nutrition, but also has a good amount of sweetness that brings you comfort.
And that's such a good point too, because for kids especially, having some normalcy and finding some joy, like I've heard a lot of my friends who are parents talking about this, like how part of the work they're doing this week, while they're freaking out sometimes on the inside is having to sort of be like, okay, how can I create little moments of joy and fun and keep a schedule for my kids? So for you to offer something, when people aren't at their houses that can bring like a little sweetness, but still be nutritious, sort of satisfying adults and kids alike, because who doesn't like a cookie? Everybody
Yeah.
likes a cookie, and it's calling it a cookie instead of putting it into granola bar shape or something else.
Yes.
It's adding that element of fun, and we need that when things are hard.
We need that when things are hard. And I think Depending on where you're at, if you're, if you're in an evacuation shelter, if you're in a hotel, like, people are eating a lot of packaged foods, and that makes sense because you just kind of need to be fed. But I think even just offering people a moment, offering the people that I know that are experiencing this, offering them a moment of like, I cared enough to cook for you. I cared enough to bring it to you. And no, this is not going to fix what's happening in your life, but it's a stepping stone to the next step that you're facing. And so that was a somewhat of an unexpected piece for me, is like, I really it forced me to think differently about this, because even last night I received a text message. It was like, "Thank you so much for your offers of soup. We can't take you up on it right now." Or like, "We can't come to your house for dinner because we just are in such crisis."
Yeah.
And one of the things that my son and I did yesterday was, we live near one of the evacuation shelters. There was a fire in our neighborhood and they put it out very quickly, but the evacuation shelter was near us. And so I made some of these granola, these morning cookies, and I had made some bread and I toasted it. I toasted the bread really well and I added some butter and brown sugar and cinnamon. So I sort of made like cinnamon toast and bread.
Mm.
And then I brewed a pot of coffee and I put it into two thermoses and I took some coffee cups with me. And my son and I went over to the evacuation shelter. And what it also reminded me is that evacuation shelters can't take your homemade food.
Yeah.
And what the sort of mitzvah of that was that,
I
you
love when you
know,
throw in the Yiddish, I love it. I love when my Midwestern Carrie
it
uses Yiddish thing or Hebrew actually even. No,
well,
it's sweet. I mean, already what you're doing is a mitzvah, but you're saying, like, the sort of blessing in what happened, right?
the blessing of making food that people can't really receive from you is that we got to the shelter and there was almost no one there, which means that they had lifted the evacuation orders, people had gone back to their houses, and the only people left were the volunteers and the people who work at the rec center in our neighborhood. And so we got to feed them. And not only did we get to feed them, but we got to chat with them, because when you take someone coffee and you give them a coffee cup of yours to drink out of, then you get to stand there and wait for them to drink their coffee. And I just found that to be such a beautiful moment for me to connect with other people that really fed me. And it was great for my son to experience as well. And I think sometimes, like, being handed, again, having had a baby and having people come and help you and just hand you things when your brain is somewhere else, sometimes you just need that.
100%. I mean, there's a couple things that I just wanna call out. In my cookbook, when I shared your recipe for granola, it's the first recipe in the book.
It is,
But I
yes.
think one of the things I say there, or maybe I say it in the acknowledgments, I may forget, but I think I said something along the lines of Carrie knows just what to bring and when to bring it. It's like one of your gifts. You just always know the exact item, which is how I've also learned to be a better food gift giver, because I'll often be like, "Oh, what would Carrie bring to this person right now?" And it's not about perfectionism, it's not about amount, it's about showing up the way you know how, which is like, "Okay, this is in my neighborhood. These are people who are helping people. I can't give the food to the people in the shelter because there's, sanitation laws or whatever around that. But the people the first responders, the volunteers can accept these gifts. And then you're also making this human connection. And then you're also having your son witness that and be part of it and he's making the connection too because he's helping hand out the coffee and the treats, and he gets to feel that he's part of it. I just think it's such a good reminder of, like, it's not small or big. It doesn't even
Oh,
it's just the showing up in whatever way you can, and if you can't bring homemade food, then sometimes even just showing up with purchased food, with a box of donuts, with, whatever it is that you can bring can f it and then it gives you energy back the way you just described, like,
yes.
instead of you sitting at home watching the news, feeling really bad, which is sort of what I've been doing from Portland, you got to feel like, "Okay, I'm doing something," and that's rewarding.
Yeah, and what the other reminder too is, because I wanted to offer some context to my son as we were leaving that space, is like what we did didn't fix the fires. And it didn't help people whose houses had been burned down. But this is something that we can do. We can do one small thing. And, you know, in my neighborhood, when people were being received at this shelter, they came at night. And, we have a small child. We had packed, we had everything in our car ready to go in case we had to go. And many of my neighbors went over there that night and were addressing like the needs that were coming in and texting everyone. And, people needed things like a blanket, and they needed a power strip, and they needed bottles of water. And so, what was amazing was that by like 9 o'clock the next morning, there were signs all around that evacuation center that said, "Thank you so much. We are full of donations." And so in a short 12 hours that had already been addressed. And so it's just like finding what is the piece that you can offer. And so I think like I would love to expand this conversation to more of like, what do you also make in spaces like this? Because I think you're kind of next level with your freezer use. And so you make these things that now I am making, like your cabbage rolls, or what you taught me about, this really great farro cauliflower parmesan dish that I found for us that
Yeah.
we were making, but like I didn't realize you could freeze that. And so,
Oh,
I sort of learned like, okay, if I make that ahead of time, I can have that in my, I'm like, how can I make that ahead of time this weekend so that in a couple weeks when someone needs food, or in a month when someone needs food, because the need is urgent now, and the need is going to continue for
yeah.
months from now, you
Yeah, I
know?
would love to swap some notes on what we bring to people. And I would just add, like, this isn't, about having the most original, we're not reinventing the wheel.
No,
Like,
no.
and I'm not trying to when I'm in this situation. So we've talked about probably a lot of these dishes before, but I think it's worth remembering these are the ones that work for this for me. And I will just add that Adrian Hill's bread recipe was, we had an episode about how to get into easy sourdough baking at home. It's a recipe even a kid can do. We'll link it again in the show notes. But Adrian's one of my very close food friends here in Portland. And just this energy of you using that recipe to feed people in your community there, it just is like what all of this is about. And it touches me so deeply. And I know, she was one of the people who texted me first to be like, how is Carrie? How are your friends in LA? Like she's just connected.
Well, this is how we help each other, because
Right.
I am not a bread expert. And this bread that I'm making, I am not a baker in that way, but like she is a bread expert and a flour expert, and she's an incredible recipe writer. And this is a very easy recipe to follow. To your point, she developed it so that children could make it. It's like no knead bread. And so she has empowered me with this recipe. And so it's like her hands and my hands, and now I can give those to people. And what's funny is, when I originally made this recipe to give to my friends who like lost their home after Christmas, the bread did not rise on time. And so I had to give them, I had an old loaf on my counter, and I made croutons with that old loaf. And then I just made the delivery because I was like, I can't give them the bread, it's not ready. And so that's why I made those morning cookies, which kind of launched me into making the morning cookies too. So it's like, to your point, it's not about being perfect, or this isn't about being gourmet. And this is about like just giving what you can in the moment.
And what's
What's
easy for
easy.
you, but then that creates so much care for others. I mean, I have to say my tried and true is my golden chicken soup or my golden vegetable soup. I call it golden because I add a lot of turmeric,
Yeah, I was
but
gonna
it's
say, why do you call it golden?
it's a lot of
Amazing.
turmeric because I think that turmeric flavor I personally really love, and I think having a golden bowl of soup is just a little bit more satisfying to the eye.
It's a gift.
Yeah, and I have both recipes in my cookbook, and they take a little time, like making like the kind of chicken soup I like to make from scratch. So when I'm making it, I'm inevitably making quarts to stock my freezer with, because if I'm going to invest that time, and it's not active time, it's throwing a bunch of chicken and vegetables and aromatics in a pot, but it's letting it simmer sometimes for 6 hours, because that's where you get so much of that rich flavor and like really, really low. And so if I'm going through all that trouble and then having to strain out all those vegetables and then I make a soup from that broth, it's a process. So I like
It's
to keep
layers of love.
yeah, but
Yes.
it's so nutrient dense. It's
Yes.
so like it's like a bone broth essentially, then with added vegetables to make it a soup. So I have also like a quick version of my chicken soup that I make, and that I'll also freeze. I just think chicken soup or a vegetarian version of chicken soup, which I also do, uh, like, almost everyone loves receiving that. If they're sick, it's something I deliver if someone's sick, or I'll just make a bone broth if someone's not feeling well, if I don't have soup in my freezer, because I know that's gonna help them. Like, I know that it is the sort of natural penicillin, that it is having some warm broth when you're not feeling well, either physically or emotionally is helpful. And then if I'm have a little more time and wanna do extra care, I'll make matzo balls. And I think matzo balls are just comfort food for Jewish people and non-Jewish people
For
alike.
every person.
Yeah.
Who
I've
doesn't love a matzo ball?
unless you're gluten-free or vegan, because matzo balls do use flour and egg, you you probably love matzo balls. And I have to say, I have also a recipe where I make matzo balls from scratch, which just means taking matzo meal, eggs, salt, like some baking powder, some baking soda. Some people use seltzer. There's a lot of different camps. I use baking powder and baking soda in a very small amount, just a small touch of it, because I think the combination of both creates the kind of matzo ball I want, which is not too fluffy and not too much of a
Yes,
sinker, has
right.
a little bit of texture, but is still light and airy. That's my preference. But I know a lot of people are afraid to make matzo balls at home because they've come out clunky or they've fallen apart.
I'm in
So
that camp.
you are.
I'm scarred by my matzo ball experience, but I really do need to look at your book and do your matzo balls.
Okay, try my matzo balls if you want, but can I just be real for a second? The matzo ball mix, not the soup mix. There's a really important distinction. You'll see packages and it says matzo ball soup mix. Don't get that. You don't need that soup. It comes in powder form. But when you just eat matzo ball mix, all it is a combination of matzo meal and spices, and then you're just adding eggs and oil to it. It's just that it's so finely ground and, like, somehow their ratios, they've really figured it out. I really implore people to use it because it makes perfect matzo balls, and then I always add fresh dill or parsley to my batter, and then it feels, like, a little bit more homemade.
Right. That makes sense. That makes total sense. And maybe I will. Maybe I do have a ton of broth going. I will say if you don't have time to make, a soup from scratch and all the things, like, one of the things that I made in trying to make soup for this family that I know is we just released a recipe on our Substack for this lemony chicken soup. And it's made with rotisserie chicken, a lemon, which gives it a little bit of lemony flavor, vegetables, greens, and a can of coconut milk, which kind of rounds it out. And, that's a much quicker, like A to Z, beginning to end recipe that you can offer someone if you don't have time to make all these other steps. And, the feedback that I received from my friend was like, she showed up at her parents' house. They all had a, soup. They didn't have bread because I didn't have bread ready for them, but they had croutons in their soup and they had these morning cookies. And then they were able to get out and do all the things that they need to do to sort of figure out the next steps for their life. And, you know, so again, it doesn't take like this long cooked thing, to really help someone in just one moment. And, I think again, it's like if you have something that you make that you can make in 30 minutes, that you can make in an hour, that you know how to make, that's where you should lean into.
Definitely, and I meant more as, like, if I'm making a big batch of
Oh, of
something,
course.
then I'm sticking in my freezer so that I can just pull it
Pull
out,
it
and
out.
then maybe the only thing I'm making is matzo balls on the side, and that takes, 30 minutes or so. I mean, they take a little chilling time. Are there any other soups that you've been delivering to people right now?
Yeah, I made one last night that was just vegetables, basic carrot, celery, onion, chicken, and I just cooked, it's like I cook so much with you in my kitchen. I had those egg noodles that I bought at the Slavic store, like really skinny spaghetti egg noodles. And so I threw those in and cooked them in the soup. And so it just like thickens it a little bit. And I actually had run out of parsley, so I didn't even add parsley. I just added like collard greens at the end. And because this family also has the family I was feeding last night has 2 little kids, I I just, like, covered the pot and I put, like, a towel around it and put it on a sheet pan, and I gave it to my husband and was like, "Here, drive this to their house."
You'll get your pot back
I
sometime.
I will get my, like, crusade back, like, I know where they live, it's fine. I wanted it to get there and be hot, and also, there are just so many moving pieces at people's houses right now, like,
Yeah.
this house that it was going to is housing 2 different families from 2 different places, and it's like people just need food, and I was able to send them a couple loaves of bread too. And I will say one of my neighbors, she is housing a couple of different friends too. She has some friends from New York that were here visiting and were evacuated from the Palisades fire, and they're staying at her house. And they're all like a generation-ish younger than me, and they're in their 30s, and they're kind of all cooking together, and so they're sort of like, you know, procrastinating. So my neighbor and her friends are procrastinating, and so they baked, like, a couple batches of chocolate chip cookies, and they brought some to our house for us, and when we went to go take them a loaf of bread, they had made this really incredible frittata for lunch, and they were all sitting around eating it, and so I think that's, like, the really lovely thing that is happening here too, is, like, people are taking in people and spending time with them and cooking with them and nourishing each other and spending time together.
It is important to call out those beautiful moments that are happening too, because there is, and especially when things can feel kind of dark and heavy. I was reminding me too of like, so it seems like we both like to make some kind of chicken or vegetable soup, or if whether it's easy or long made, doesn't even really matter. Throwing in some cookies or some bread. I do the same thing. I'll often throw in a challah. I try to always throw in chocolate chip cookies if I can when I'm doing one of these deliveries, just because I know people love these cookies. But I also think everybody loves chocolate chip cookies,
Yeah,
no matter the recipe. So
it's
I feel like
comforting.
keep it simple. I don't need to go crazy, but I know that's gonna make someone happy. The other thing I was thinking about when you were talking about, like, what are, like, easy, quick dishes that you can make, I was thinking about we had some friends who were in the hospital for a long time with a baby, it wasn't just in the NICU, it was more serious than that, and so they were essentially, like, living in the hospital for months, and there was a meal train, and so sometimes it's thinking about, like, what is the setting for something, and I also knew that they really love, like, whole foods, like, meaning foods that aren't heavily processed, they don't eat a ton of grains, and so sometimes you get kinda stuck, you're like, "All right, they have dietary needs, they're in a setting where they only have a microwave, like, can I get something to them hot?" So I did, like, try to time very easily be like, "Okay, when would you like to have dinner? Can I show up and have it be hot?" And so one of my go-to things for those kinds of instances is I just make, uh, chicken thighs and sweet potatoes in whatever spices I have on hand. It doesn't matter. And there's something about the combination of, and I usually throw onions in there too. Onions are an important part, or leeks. The thing about when you do a sheet pan meal like this, or even a casserole dish where you take your sweet potatoes, you cut them into wedges or large pieces, you put bone and skin on thighs on top, you nestle in some leeks or some onion wedges, and then you spice that with whatever you might have. It could be some turmeric and coriander. It could be some, chili spices, like a chili mix. Whatever profile you think your people will enjoy, or keep it real basic with salt and pepper and maybe some garlic powder. It's a very, very simple dish, but it's extremely homey and nourishing and comforting. And you can just pop that sheet pan into the oven. It's going to cook in 45 minutes or so. It's gonna be done. I always put that in, like, a casserole dish or into one of those disposable, like, foil pans that they don't have to deal with something, especially if they're at the hospital. Wrap that up in foil, wrap that up in a towel to sort of add more, like, insulation. I grab that, I throw it in my trunk, I get a salad. I've already had, like, a salad mix and some dressing. That meal is gonna really feel home cooked, especially in a setting where that's not what they're eating and that's not what's around them. And it's so simple, but I've always found that it's helpful. It's a helpful meal.
I think that's a genius idea. That reminds me of what I'm trying to learn by making a whole roast chicken. Like, this is kind of your roast chicken recipe, but you've kind of cut it up. you've made it easier for people to receive because it's in chicken, chicken thighs instead of like a whole chicken that you have to kind of cut apart. And it's less, it's easier to work with. And
Yes, and it's the other thing, it's like so you could do chicken thighs or whole chicken legs, but the
yes.
important thing is bone in and skin on, and the reason is it will crisp up, which is lovely, but it also won't dry out. And so I'm thinking about foods that are traveling, and so let's say I bring it to them at 6 and they're but then suddenly they got pulled away and couldn't eat dinner, and now they're gonna have to reheat that meal. I want them to have a chicken experience where it's not dry. So that's why I'm always using dark meat for these kinds of dinners.
Yeah, it's more forgiving, and I really think this idea of, like, what's the setting that you're taking food to people to, is an idea that's really been coming through for me. And, we have been recently talking about making these like a broccoli salad, like a broccoli crunch salad, or, this this Hetty McKinnon salad with like broccoli and dates and white beans. Those are the kinds of things that, a deli salad that you can give to people in a jar or in a container, a plastic container that they can toss or take home or rinse out and put something else in, like making it as easy on them as possible, but something even handheld and just kind of like ready to go. And it reminded me of how you always make overnight oats. And I actually made overnight oats last night because of you.
Oh, in a mason jar.
In a mason jar. I made overnight oats last night because of you in a mason jar, and I kind of loosely followed Zoe Francois's morning cookies idea because I had all these ingredients, and so
Right. It's
I
almost like
added
muesli. You, like,
it's
added liquid or yogurt. Did you add both?
I added a little bit of soy milk because
Uh-huh.
I had a thing of soy milk in my pantry, and then oats, I added a little bit of honey on top of that. I had toasted cashews and toasted pepitas and some currants and some dried sour cherries, and then there were chocolate chips, so I added some chocolate chips on top too. And
Cute.
it's such a delicious, like, you can hand that to someone.
You can hand overnight oats. That's a great idea too if you need to be delivering breakfast, because sometimes breakfast is forgotten when you're
Yes.
doing meal deliveries, and a lot of people need breakfast. I feel like that's such a good reminder for me that you could do a chia pudding or an overnight oats, and that's like a really that will keep for a week in the fridge in a mason jar. And also getting things in a mason jar is something you taught me, which is like if you deliver your soup in a large mason jar, and I'm full disclosure, I don't always do this. I don't want to claim like I feel like this is like aspirational for me sometimes. I sometimes just have like the deli quart containers, but when I receive something in a mason jar and when I give something in a mason jar, I feel like it whatever it is that just that much special. And like even this isn't necessarily like a time in need, but over the holidays I was testing recipes for these like candied spiced hazelnuts that I want to share, and I was just putting them into little jars and giving them to people. And yeah, it's not like a major gift to give someone candy nuts, and you can
I
find
mean, to
that.
me, that is a major gift. I received a major gift like that for Christmas this year, and I loved every second of it.
I think that that's the point though, right? Like so
Yeah.
if you can't make a whole meal, making something simple like a candy nut or an overnight oats or a granola bar or just one cookie or just chocolate chip the Toll House recipe. These are all things that everyone is going to be so happy to receive. And it's again that return of energy. Of course, it feels good to be helpful in a time where we can feel like not powerless, but that, like there's not much we can do.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that you mentioned with your friends who are staying at a hospital for an extended amount of time is that, they were people who really eat a lot of whole foods. And when you said that, it reminded me that, like, I also really like to give people fruit. And,
Yes.
you think about what kind of fruits can sit well, or, it's actually something that's on my mind because they're canceling farmers markets this weekend because, the air quality is not great here. And so but that's always something that is my go-to is like if I go to the farmer's market and I, depending on the season, buy really beautiful plums that I'm giving people, or like my favorite apples, or, even just the nuts from the farmers at the farmer's market are so much, they're so delicious compared to what you can get at the grocery store. And so sharing those things with people, and, something that's handheld, like right now in California, our citrus is like there's so much citrus.
And
And
we
so,
get citrus from California too, it's amazing, and
yes.
it's the time to give someone little mandarins or tangerines.
Exactly,
Yeah.
because they're sitting around in their hotel room or their house or at a hospital, and you can take the time to peel an orange. There's something about that experience that I think is really nice, and you can, or they can grab an apple or even just get them a bunch of bananas that you take them with like with a dozen cookies or a couple dozen cookies, like letting someone know that you cared to think about whether they had a snack, whether they had something to eat for breakfast, is that's kind of where it's at, right? Is like the
Yes, it's
care.
so important, and this is not handheld, and it's a little bit tricky, but I have to say, every time I give someone a pomegranate, they're over the moon. There's something about receiving a pomegranate, which I've learned, especially if you're a guest at someone's house, not in crisis. This is sort of not a crisis food, but I've come a lot of times with a pomegranate and like a bottle of wine or something. People love receiving one. I think I've fallen into this trap too before where it's like sometimes you feel like if you don't do something soon enough, then it's too late. And then you start to beat yourself up, but then and you end up doing nothing at all. What I've learned and the advice that's been passed down to me is it's never too late. So, even in this crisis, I was texting, my family and closest friends first. And then by the next day, I was like, oh gosh, I didn't text so and so, but I care about them. And then I was like, oh, it's so rude to text so late. It's already been going on. And I was like, "No, Sonia, just text them. Just see, even if they're fine and they're fine because they've been posting on social." I know when I've been on the opposite end of things, it just always is meaningful, even if it comes a week later. So I feel like the same thing with food. It's never too late. Even if someone is not in their peak crisis moment, even if the storm has passed, you can always show up or send a text or whatever, and it's still going to mean something to that person.
I'm so glad that you brought that point back, back to talk a little bit more about, because I think that that's that the way that I would think about that is like when you have a baby, when you've had a death in your family, there's this swelling of support, right? Almost too much. It's like how
Yes.
many bagels can you eat? How many lasagnas can you eat in the first couple weeks of what you're experiencing? But like a month later, 2 months later, 3 months later, this is going to be going on for a long time. And so I think like thinking about longevity, like what you're doing now is enough, and what you can do in the future is enough. And I think also like send the text. I'm receiving a lot of texts because I have people that live on the other side of the country that don't have context of where I live versus where the fires are. And so, depending on what time of day they're texting me, like the people who are if I'm waking up to a text, I'm usually responding to it, but in the middle of the day I'm in the kitchen. And so I've missed a couple of over the few days, and it's like people also haven't responded to me. I know they're okay, but like I just keep pinging people because, they want, even if they can't respond, receiving that means something. And
Yeah.
I think it's an expression of care.
And it's never too late.
It's never too late. So,
Well, I'm glad we got to talk about this. And we really are sending so much love to everyone affected by these fires. I can't think of anyone who lives in LA who's not immediately affected, who doesn't know someone who's lost a home, who doesn't know someone who's had to evacuate. And I know anyone who has lived in LA is touched by these. So, yeah, we just, are just sending our love to everyone.
yeah, and if you want to help, whether you're here or whether you're outside of our city, I think both Sonia and I agree that World Central Kitchen is an amazing resource. It's an amazing organization that really rushes into spaces like this all over the world that are experiencing a trauma and where people just need to be fed. And so making a donation to World Central Kitchen, whether it's $5 or $15 or whatever it is that you have available, is a way that you can let people know that you care, even if you're not able to like deliver your favorite chocolate chip cookie to someone.
Exactly. And another amazing thing that World Central Kitchen does is they find the farmers who have produce that they couldn't sell to the restaurants or to the people, and they make sure to buy those products from farmers and purveyors so that everyone and all these small businesses can continue to be supported while helping the first responders, while helping evacuees. They're always the first in the front lines, and their systems are really incredible. So they're one of my favorite organizations too, as you mentioned. And also, what's been as someone who's far away, but has my heart there and so many loved ones and immediate family there, sometimes it's been helpful to me to find individual people's GoFundMe's and be able to make a direct impact. So, that's something I always also look to in these crises. There are ways to sort of contribute from afar. So we just want to share some of those with all of you.
Yeah. Well, Sonia, I'm really glad we had this conversation. I'm glad we were able to pivot today. And it's helped keep me going. For all the people who know me personally and have texted me and reached out to check on us, like that's really helping me. It's helping me show up for my people here. And, I think we all have to care for one another because, when this sorts out and LA moves through this crisis, there will inevitably be some other need. And so I think that's, as people who like to cook and who care about food, it's a way for us to contribute to the well being of one another.
Yeah. Well, until next time,
Until next time,
bye.
bye. Thanks for being our food friend.
If you enjoyed our podcast, please subscribe, leave us a review, and share this episode with friends. We love hearing from you, so follow us on Instagram or drop us a line at foodfriendspodcast.com.
Yes, we'd love to hear from you and your food friends. Happy cooking and eating.